Welcome to the Do Not Ignore Your Mortality podcast. Today my guest is Barry Gordon, and he's the author of a book, Avoiding Chaos. I believe the name of it is, Barry. Is that right?
Yeah. So avoiding chaos, and it's 8 discussions that you need to have for stress-free downsizing and estate settlement. And so it's geared toward the both downsize and estate settlement crowd.
Yes, and I guess that's an increasing type of service that is needed in our society with aging demographics and so on.
Yeah. So of course the demographic is large, right? And there's an overlap for the folks that are downsizing. In our world, it's Gordon's Downsizing and Estate Services. And really, we're a real estate company for downsizers and a real estate company for executors. And we include a package of value around the kinds of things that both of those audiences require. And the book really helps people understand what the framework is that they're dealing in, is what the world looks like. So many people, when they go to, and let's talk about estates because it's more consistent with, well, you know what, they're both on the overlap of your book, in planning for your mortality. Because often these days, people downsize because they live long enough to downsize. 50 years ago, people didn't live as long and they didn't really think about moving again. They'd been entrenched in a house for a long time. They probably had lots of community around, familiarity, et cetera, and family close by. And we know these days things are a whole lot more fragmented. But the core thing, I think, is that people live long enough to have other situations that are a better fit for them. And when they decide to downsize, a lot of those folks might be mid-80s already. And the downsizing is a stressful situation. So our theme is make it as low stress as possible, get it as organized as you can, and we'll help with all that. But nonetheless, it's a stressful event. And anytime somebody in a senior demographic in particular is going through a stressful event, it's a good time to tee up on planning for their mortality. Make sure that their will is fresh, that their power of attorneys are relevant, that they still make sense because, lots of changes may have taken place in their life before that. And then, of course, we get them through that downsize as easily as we can. And then sometimes we're dealing with some of the same families from an estate standpoint. And then other folks don't make the downsize and they're dealing with the estate trustees dealing with the estate, and it still has property and everything else in it. So ours is kind of a framework to let them know what the kinds of questions are, right? Where to start.
Yes. It seems to me, from my experience in the funeral industry and also being working as a financial planner for years, Barry, that there's a lot of inertia when it comes to these sorts of issues. They're easy to put off and make a decision later or even avoid the conversations altogether.
Yeah. Some people do find it's hard to confront the conversations. And as you point out in your book, you've got to do it. You've got to face these conversations because the last thing you want is, are all of them, right? You don't want a situation where you don't have a will or your will is so out of date that it's irrelevant. I mean, we're dealing with several estates today throughout Ontario where someone has passed away and they've had something, sometimes a will, sometimes not. But in either case, we have situations where there are elements of the will that require notifications and sign-offs from people because of changes in people's lives. And then you're chasing people down. The lawyers' offices are chasing people down to get affidavits signed, to get more endorsements behind the situation, to validate maybe a will that wasn't, perfect at the time. And it causes great delay. And we also know the probate courts these days and many jurisdictions across Ontario are really, really slow as well. They're really backed up. So we used to find in the GTA that it was common for probate to take 9 months, 10 months, a year, maybe more. It's getting a little bit better now, but a lot of smaller communities where it used to be 6 weeks or 4 weeks or 3 weeks are getting extended to their 5 months and 6 months and 8 months. So lots of backlog there as well. So in any case, wills that are really in order and really up to date, I mean, that's important stuff.
Right. And can you remind the listeners, please, Barry, what probate is?
So probate is the act of the jurisdiction proving the will. So in Ontario, it's the Ontario government, and they need to prove the will, and they prove the will in some estates where, let's say, it's a last to die that lives in a retirement community and they don't have significant assets, or maybe a probate isn't required. But for anyone that has significant assets, a bank account with significant dollars in it, RSPs, etc., a house or property, any of those folks that pass away with those things in ownership, that will is going to have to be probated. Generally speaking, there are some exceptions, but most people should plan on that activity, that it needs to go through probate, which is the province approving the will, so that the estate trustee, the named estate trustee, has the authority in property to transfer title, or in bank accounts to get access to them, to be able to deal with the kinds of things that the estate trustee needs to deal with.
Right. So generally speaking, you would tend to agree with me and many other people that, I guess, Barry, that being proactive and planning for these things in advance, while one has the clear mind and the capability to do it, is vitally important.
Oh, yeah, that's right. And then back to the discussion of downsizing. When someone's downsizing and going through the stress, before they get overly stressed, because stress exacerbates mental health and mental decline and acuity decline, you want to be sure that you've got your powers of attorneys right. So because anything could happen at any time, of course, a slip and fall, etc. But once you get, a person has diminished capacity or lost capacity, they can't change those things, as you know. And we see lots of situations where what a person wanted 30 years ago may not be the best thing or what they want today, but they just didn't revisit it. Right. So, and maybe elements of the will that were valid then aren't valid anymore because some of the characters aren't around anymore.
Right. Or the jurisdictional rules may have changed, et cetera. So it seems to me, Barry, that the time to perhaps consider downsizing as well is when one has a more, I guess, a better state of mind without a major health issue being also in the equation, maybe.
Yeah. So the idea is to be proactive, right? Now, in being proactive, you should kind of ask yourself on an ongoing basis as you age, right? Am I living in the right place? Am I in the place that's the best place for me, right? And it changes over time as you get older, and your needs change, et cetera, right? A lot of times, loss of a spouse, one person's left alone. They decide that managing snow blowing, managing lawns, managing gardens, managing upkeep on the house, et cetera, managing stairs are things that are risky for them and or cost them money on a regular basis. And maybe they want to get to a spot that's a little bit more conducive to an easier lifestyle. Somebody else is doing the cooking, somebody else is doing the cleaning, or maybe just a smaller space, right? So the downsize, being proactive, puts you in a spot, ideally to have a longer runway from the harms that might create an earlier demise, right? So you don't want to get, somebody told me one time many years ago, his goal was to live long and die fast. And that's a good way to go if you can get it, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's right. The statistics, unfortunately, about so many people not having a current and valid will, I think the stats have been this way in Canada for quite some time, that only about half the adult population has a current and valid will. And that seems to be the case in quite a number of other countries too. But it's surprising that in such a advanced country that is Canada that we live in, Barry, that regardless of how the legal community has promoted people get on side with this and get planning, and the funeral industry and the financial industry, et cetera, it still amazes me that so many people continue to procrastinate in this way.
Yeah. And I guess different people have different reasons. You hear everything from, I'm going to just let the next generation look after it. And then, other people just don't want to confront it because of the complexity. Maybe they feel like it's too overwhelming and they don't want to decide. But as you know, if you if you die intestate, if you die without a will, um, what happens afterward is going to follow a certain protocol, and it may not be what you want at all. Particularly you see things like second marriages and a lot of that stuff these days, right? Whereas even if a person had a will and they got married, we have one situation where a gentleman got married, and then after several years, I guess his wife, he got divorced, but he didn't update his will after his marriage. So when he passed away, his will, the lawyers needed to do a search to ensure that the other person's interest was gone. I can't just remember all the details around it, but the key really was for him is that because he'd been married, the track that he was on needed to get a little bit of confirmation. He wanted to leave his estate to his two sons, and he did, and it worked out that way. But it took 6 or 8 months of court process to get to the spot where they had the authority and ability to proceed.
Right. And anytime we can arrange our own affairs without involving a court, typically is a whole lot better, isn't it?
Yeah, it sure is. Yeah. And there's lots of pointers in your book on how people can get on to these things and make sure that they're taking control of them. Certainly everyone should. And, as you know, Greg, making a will isn't expensive. It's not a highly expensive proposition. There's lots of lawyers that specialize in it, can give you good advice. If you have some complexity, it's a little more expensive than something that's really straightforward. But for most folks, it's a pretty straightforward thing. You sit down and talk to the lawyer about your priorities and who you want to reward most, et cetera, and where you want your legacy.
Yes. And I even bring up the fact in my book as well, Barry, that people can actually, for a nominal amount these days, go online and actually set up a will. But there are certain cautions to that. If their situation involves support payments to children, as an example, or they own any portion of a business or property outside of their jurisdiction, they certainly need to be seeing an estate planning lawyer.
Yeah, so those are all important things. I mean, in our business, we're dealing with lawyers, of course, and we tend to think that's best practice. The online will business is good at least in that it makes it more likely that more people have access to getting something done easily, and at least at that basis that it has validity for sure. And then after that, it's really how thorough you want to be.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Well, it's certainly a message that I'm trying harder to make as a more of an inspiring message to people. I'm promoting what I'm calling the Living Legacy program, which will help survivors after a death be more financially and emotionally resilient, more apt to get along. It'll help more people leave more meaningful legacies, and it'll help courts through the process of estate planning have more money to do more of their good work, and ultimately take a huge, immense burden off the court systems from having to deal with so many unorganized estates. So I'm really hoping that this type of message resonates with more people so that they lean into it and get talking with their family members about what they want to have happen, and take advantage of people, many people that are out there in the financial and legal industry that can actually help them pull together the planning based on their goals and objectives.
Yeah, and there's lots of folks in the planning business that are pretty easy to access as well, that aren't going to it's not big upfront money. If you've got someone that's managing your money, for folks that have some situation like that, that's a close connection to some of the financial planning stuff as well. And as you know, there's lots of pieces in the insurance business that are good pieces of estate planning as well. So there's lots of different aspects, and people should be connecting with someone that understands that landscape. One of the questions we ask everyone when we're downsizing someone is, do you have these documents in order, et cetera? And do you have a financial planner? And does your financial planner know that you're downsizing? And we know from those questions that until we ask it, most haven't actually conferred with a financial planner about the fact that they're going to come into a fairly big liquid capital piece of equity from the sale of their house. And most folks really, ideally, I mean, you want to look after that money and preserve it and make it work for you as you change to a different stage of your life. And often your financial planner is somebody that you want involved in that.
Yes, yeah, communication is key, and that's the very first chapter in my book. We should, before we finish this recording here, Barry, we should hold up our books for viewers just to remind them that this book that I've written actually stresses that very thing. The very first chapter in Do Not Ignore Your Mortality is communication and how vitally important that is. And anyone can find my book on my website, donotignoreyourmortality.com.
Yep. And then here's Avoiding Chaos. It's a good read it's a good and maybe a 3 or 4 hour read. It's fairly quick for someone who is considering downsizing or dealing with an estate. And there are a number of good other things that we could connect them to as well. But thanks very much, Greg. It's been a pleasure visiting with you about all this stuff.
Yes. Thank you. I appreciate your time, Barry. You've got a great message, and I hope you're able to help a lot of people with this important planning.
Perfect. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you.